Welcome back to Hot Air with me, Joshua Robert. And today we're getting into a topic that is as important as it is a wee bit painful, and one that I have touched on before: conversion therapy and its devastating impact on the LGBTQ plus people around the globe. We're going to talk history, survivor stories, international context, memoirs, and the long lasting damage that's often overlooked. This episode is raw, it's honest, it's completely unapologetic, which I imagine you would expect nothing less, and it's all about amplifying voices that need to be heard. And before we jump in, make sure you're following me on Instagram and TikTok at _hotairpod for some behind the scenes content and little clips from each episode to get you excited. And if you have a story that you want to share or a topic that you think I should cover, you can submit it on hotairwithjoshuarobert.com on the contact page. And obviously, I want to hear from you. And don't forget, while you're there, to check out my merch, which there's plenty to pick from. I am wearing the Hot Air t-shirt today that also comes in a super cute hoodie and a mug and a tumbler. And every purchase helps keep Hot Air alive and loud and proud. And on that point, let's build on that a little bit, because January's episodes are coming in very soon. I'm already working on them, and I am curious because, it is New Year, new me, but we're going to put the Hot Air spin on it. I'm going to try to cover family, friendships, both health and wellness, physically and mentally, a little bit of spirituality, things that help us level up and ways to move on and let go. I have a world-renowned, and that is no exaggeration, she is world-renowned. I am so stoked to have her on, a trauma therapist who is going to talk us through what exactly it is that she does and maybe some easy at-home ways that we can begin to heal or start our healing journey in the new year. I'll also be meeting with some very special health and wellness coaches that you may have heard from before on Hot Air, who opened a brand new space here in San Diego that is dope as hell. If all goes according to plan, it might be my first on location episode, which is very exciting. Only thing we're not going to cover is dating and romantic relationships, because February is going to be all about that. Also, sex. We barely even talked about sex on this podcast. I'm like, come on, this is a gay podcast. Where is the sex? So anyway, if there's anything you want to know, things that you want to learn, ideas that you have for me to explore, or even ideas, things that you have done that have helped you level up and start your new year. I know everyone's not like a new year, new me kind of person or New Year's resolution kind of person, and that's fine. I just think it's always a great opportunity to revisit your past, learn from your past, and then start shifting and adjusting things, should you feel that you need to. Anyway, so if you have any suggestions, things you think I should cover, you can also submit that, I guess, on my Instagram or TikTok, slide in my DMs, or on the website, topic suggestions as well. Oh, okay, deep breath, take a sip of water, stretch of the neck maybe, maybe a little prayer if you're feeling religious, or given the subject of today's episode, maybe not a little prayer at all. But truly, if you're religious or very conservative or in denial or just plain fragile, this will probably be the episode where you're going to clutch your pearls so tight that they strangle you. But just be careful if you're holding onto those pearls. And again, because I feel like I need to say this every episode, just to be clear, every episode in December, just to be clear, this is not an attack on religion. It is not an attack on personal belief. You are allowed to believe whatever sky daddy you want. You believe in Jesus? Go for it. Great. Buddha. Cool. Astrology, TikTok, valid choice. Whatever. A haunted doll named Tiffany? Honestly, go the fuck off, because that's where you'll find me, worshiping a haunted doll named Tiffany. I am all for religious freedom. But as I've been saying a lot this month, the month of December, facts are facts and history is history. And when religion is used as a weapon instead of a guide, we have a long overdue conversation to have. I also want to highlight and remind you that throughout this episode, you should remind yourself that the Bible and religion has been rewritten and manipulated for basically fucking ever. And it's been done to suit those that are in power. I've talked about it in length on the past 2 episodes here in December. So while we talk about conversion therapy on a global scale in this episode, remember that the only reason we got to this point was due to religious leaders colonizing other countries and forcing their beliefs onto others in an attempt to control them. Huh? Why? And then again, homosexual did not appear in the Bible until its rewrite in 1946. So there's that. Humans did this. This is all done by humans, not Jesus or your sky daddy, okay? So we're diving in very deep. I mean, like deep throating into one of the darkest, most hidden chapters of modern religious and psychological practice, conversion therapy. Let's hit it. Let's start with the basics. What is conversion therapy? Well, conversion therapy, also called reparative therapy or sexual orientation change efforts, is the harmful and completely discredited practice of trying to change a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. And in plain English, it's when people say, hey, being gay, lesbian, bisexual, or trans is wrong, and let's traumatize it out of you. Gross. I know, super fucking gross. And this type of therapy has taken many forms over the years. Talk therapy, prayer sessions, exorcisms, forced fasting, isolation, correctional camps, behavioral conditioning, electroshock therapies, forced medication, physical punishment, emotional abuse, public shaming, and guess who was the original sponsor of all of these nightmares? Not Freddy fucking Krueger, but you guessed it, religion. Specifically, fundamentalist interpretations of Christianity. There was a belief, and there still is in plenty of spaces, that homosexuality is a sin, that it's a sickness, a moral failure, or the result of trauma, bad parenting, or demons. Actual demons, like dungeon crawling, hellfire, brimstone types, like kind of guys I usually date. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, when psychology was still in its let's rub cocaine on it and see what happens era, which I think a lot of gays still do rub cocaine on it and see what happens, but being gay was labeled as a mental disorder. So churches, doctors, and governments teamed up like the worst Avengers movie ever made. Kind of like how they thought that when women would menstruate, they were witches, like that kind of complete I guess lack of science and understanding. There was no Iron Man here in this Avengers, just fucking trauma. By the 1950s and 60s, conversion techniques included things like forcing people to look at same-sex images while receiving electric shocks, showing them straight images afterward as positive reinforcement, which would induce nausea while exposing them to LGBTQ plus imagery. They would also lock them in institutions until they repented. And let me just say, if your sexuality journey includes electroshock therapy, that is not a sexuality journey. That is quite literally a horror movie. You are living in a horror movie. And what makes this worse is that many people subjected to this were not adults. They were children, teenagers, and they were sent in by terrified religious families. Which brings us to the harsh truth that no one wants to talk about. Most people don't choose conversion therapy. It is chosen for them, which I think we all know, but we don't really sit with that enough. People are forced into this. It's very unlikely that some 17-year-old kid is going to be like, you know what? Yeah, I don't want to be gay or a lesbian or trans. I'm going to go shock it the fuck out of me. Like, it's highly unlikely that you're going to choose that. So it was chosen for them by parents, by churches, by schools, by God-fearing institutions, by people who think love looks like control, and people that simply, I mean, I hate to say this, but don't know better. That's giving them a bit too much benefit of the doubt, but here we are. Now, in recent decades, most medical and psychological organizations, including the American Psychological Association and the World Health Organization, have declared conversion therapy dangerous, unethical, and ineffective. Of course, research has shown that it leads to increased suicide risk, depression, anxiety, PTSD, substance abuse, self-harm, broken family relationships, long-term trauma, shame tied directly to identity, and despite all of that, it still happens around the world. I'm going to go out on a limb here, a limb, maybe both, a whim and a limb, and I'm going to say, why don't we try that with the racists? Why don't we conversion therapy racist motherfuckers out of being racist? Or misogynizers, or rapists, or murderers. Like, we don't do that to them, literal criminals, but we do it to the queer community. Make it make sense. You can't. Now, sometimes conversion therapy is called something else, like counseling or prayer group, biblical realignment, faith healing, spiritual coaching, or reformation. New name, same abuse, kind of like how companies rebrand after a scandal. And Lord knows the church has more than enough scandals. So let me ask you something real quick. If God is perfect and God created me, and God doesn't make mistakes, why do you need to send me to somebody to fix me? That does not make any sense. They'll use the you're possessed, they'll use there's a demon, they'll use some sort of weird upbringing or whatever. But the answer is it doesn't make sense. There's always going to be an excuse, but it doesn't track, doesn't make sense. The math ain't mathin'. And it never will, and it never did. It was never about faith, it was all about fear. Fear of difference, fear of breaking tradition, and fear of losing power. There were entire ministries created around ex-gay identities that later collapsed when the leaders came out publicly and said they were still gay. Because shockingly, you can't, shockingly is an interesting choice of words, you can't pray or shock the gay away. What a wild spoiler alert. And for many of the survivors whose stories we are going to dive into the next segment, the damage wasn't just emotional, it was spiritual as well. Their sense of faith and trust and safety in the world was completely shattered. Imagine being told you are an abomination by the same people who are supposed to teach you love. Like, sit with that. Just that alone will fuck you up. Conversion therapy is not just harmful, it's a form of identity violence. It tries to erase who you are at your core. And the only reason that I can openly talk about this so passionately, loudly, and sassily right now is because people before me survived it and lived to tell the truth. And also, I've never had to experience anything like this. So it's easy for me to kind of sound off. And those voices of people who have experienced this are where we are going to go into part 2 of our exploration of conversion therapy. We're going to talk stories of being sent away to conversion programs, being held in religious institutions, being subjected to psychological and physical abuse, being told to hate their own bodies and minds, and still finding a way back to themselves. Because, baby, there is nothing more powerful than someone who refused to disappear. Not me forgetting to say part 1 again when we started part 1, but here's part 2, first-person accounts and survivor testimonies. You know, one of the most haunting things about conversion therapy isn't just what happens inside of those rooms or churches or camps or offices where they try to quote unquote fix you. It's the silence that comes after, the way so many people walk out and never talk about it again. Not because it wasn't horrible enough to mention, but because it was too horrible to put into words. So now I'm going to be the loudmouth they didn't feel safe enough to be at the time. I'm going to hold the mic up to their stories, not to exploit them, not to dramatize them, but to honor the fact that they survived something that was supposed to erase them, and they lived to tell their story. Now, one survivor who shared her story through an LGBTQ rights organization described spending nearly a decade in conversion therapy. After almost 10 years of her life, from a young age, being constantly told that her attraction to women was a sickness, a brokenness, a defect that needed to be repaired. Imagine that. Not just once, not just during one dramatic conversation on a couch, but over and over and over again, week after week, session after session, being taught that the most natural part of her was a flaw. That loving someone who looked like her was something shameful. She was pushed to trace her feelings back to her childhood, to blame her parents, to blame trauma, to blame herself. And the absolute worst part, she wanted to believe them. Because when authority figures tell you that you are wrong and you're a kid or someone desperate to belong, you start trying to edit yourself to fit their idea of normal. She spent years trying to pray herself straighter, trying to convince herself that if she just worked harder, believed harder, begged harder, God would finally flip some invisible straight switch inside of her. Instead of changing her sexuality, all it did was carve shame deeper into her bones. She eventually got out. She eventually realized that there was nothing wrong with her in the first place, but she lost years, 10 years to that lie. Years of self-hatred disguised as healing. I don't think we talk about this topic enough, but I also don't think we realize the long term game here. Like, this isn't just you go to a camp for 6 weeks, which is way too much time, or one session, which is way too much time. Some of these things last for a decade, if not longer. And it's like, truly, if God was that powerful, you'd think 10 years of praying the gay away would be enough to make the gay go away. It doesn't work. Another survivor writing for a queer media platform talked about being pushed into conversion therapy at an evangelical Christian college. Not a clinic, not a hospital, a college, a place you're supposed to go to learn, to grow, and explore who you actually are. And instead, it became the place where her identity was treated like a problem that needed to be disciplined out of her. She describes the way that the language was always softened. They didn't say, "We're here to torture you." They said, "We're here to guide you. We're here to help. We're here to save you." But that help came with conditions. You had to reject who you were. You had to confess your thoughts. You had to monitor your desires. You had to be accountable for your own existence. She describes how the constant pressure, the constant surveillance of her mind, her body, her attractions began to manifest in other ways, like eating disorders, crippling anxiety, thoughts of suicide. Because when you are told that the core of who you are is wrong, your brain starts trying to escape your body altogether. And when the world outside already feels unsafe, your own mind becomes a prison. She eventually left and began to rebuild her life, but the recovery is ongoing because trauma doesn't have an expiration date. Would be great if it did, if that date was tomorrow. It doesn't just pack up and leave because you figured it out intellectually. It lingers, it whispers, it shows up when you try to love somebody. It shows up when someone touches you and your body remembers being told no. As I said in the previous episode, like sometimes I have a weird relationship with watching porn, obviously gay porn, as I've said before. And I never went to conversion therapy. It's just one of those tiny little neural pathways that still needs to be rewired from 20 years, 20 plus years of being bullied so badly that there's still that little bit of shame. So imagine that when you've underwent years or a year or weeks of this type of conversion therapy and you go and try to date someone, you try to have a romantic relationship with a same-sex partner, or you try to transition from male to female or female to male, or you're figuring all of that out, how awkward, how hurtful, how uncomfortable that would be. I mean, I actually don't even want to think about it because that, I don't know if I could deal. There are also stories of non-binary and gender diverse people who were sent not just to one program, but repeatedly, summer after summer, as if queerness was a seasonal flu that clearly hadn't been fully cured yet. One person shared how between the ages of 12 and 15, they were sent to different camps and counseling programs meant to realign their identity. Instead of summers filled with friendship and freedom and awkward teenage memories, their summers were filled with prayer circles, shame talks, isolation, and being told that their sense of self was a mistake. Every year they left hoping maybe it would be different. Maybe this time something would click and they could finally just be the version that everyone wanted them to be. And every year they came back feeling more confused, more broken, more alone. That kind of repetitive rejection by the very people who are supposed to protect you teaches your nervous system that love is conditional, that acceptance is earned by self-betrayal. And that is one of the hardest lessons to unlearn. Then there are people who went through conversion practices that blurred the line between religion and outright psychological torture. Survivors who were subjected to intense religious counseling that included exorcism-like rituals, aggressive prayer sessions, being held down while people prayed over them, being told demons were inside of them causing their homosexuality. Imagine being a teenager and having adults scream prayers over your body as if you are possessed, as if your identity is some kind of evil parasite that needs to be dragged out of you. I feel so uncomfortable just saying that. That is not faith. That is horror movie material. And I love horror movies, but not like this. And some of those survivors eventually sought legal action, not just for themselves, but so it would not happen to anyone else again, because the trauma didn't stop when the sessions ended. It followed them into adulthood, into relationships, into sleep, nightmares, panic attacks, fear of intimacy, fear of God, and fear of themselves. What links all of these stories together isn't just the fact they went through conversion therapy, it's the pattern of being told who they were supposed to be, the pattern of adults projecting fear onto them, the pattern of love becoming conditional, and yet every single one of them, in some way, fought their way back. That's the part that deserves to be screamed from the rooftops. They found words, they found community, they found other queer people who looked at them and said, "You're not broken. You never were." And slowly, piece by piece, they were able to build themselves up again. And I imagine a lot of them are still healing and may forever be on that path towards healing. And like I said, that gets me all very emotional because I think of how powerful it is to be told for years that you are wrong and still find the courage to exist anyway, to look at a world that tried to erase you and say, "I'm still here, louder, gayer, and just getting started." And that's something I can really relate to because it wasn't until this past year, I think the beginning of 2025, when I started being like, you know what? You need to start being, not you need to, trying to cut that word out of my vocabulary. I always say that in therapy, and my therapist is like, you don't have to, you would like to. So last year, I was like, I would like to live more authentically, be more comfortable in my own skin. Obviously, I was very out. I date men. I live in the gayborhood, but that doesn't mean internally that I'm like 100% like on my own team, if that makes any sense. So these people fighting their way back from this wild abuse and trauma and deciding I am going to live my most authentic life, even though some of them went through weeks, months, years of this conversion type therapy and abuse, they made the decision to crawl and fight their way back and build themselves up and just be who they are. That's so powerful. That is so important that we all do that, regardless of our levels of trauma or the horrible things we've experienced. I carry a lot of my bullying that I went through in school with me, and I project that onto others, anticipating what they might say or do. So anyway, I'm on a tangent, but I can't imagine that times 7,000. I can't even imagine what it's like to have adults hold you down and scream at you and try to pray a demon out of you. And then you just, after a few years, you're like, fuck this, I'm going to be gay. It's really hard for me to wrap my head around because I don't know that I would have the strength to do that. So kudos to them. And there might even be people listening right now who have gone through religious trauma who have never labeled it like that. You just thought that's how it was. That's how I was raised. That's how it's supposed to be. But hearing these stories from people who have actually experienced this type of conversion therapy, you might be realizing for the first time that what happened to you was not normal. There's very subtle ways to go about this conversion as well. It was not love. It wasn't guidance. It was control dressed up as salvation. And if nobody's told you this yet, let me be very clear. There is nothing wrong with you, regardless of how you identify. Your identity is not a disease. Your love is not a problem. Your body is not a mistake. And anybody who made you feel that way did not speak for God, the universe, energy, science, or human decency. These survivors did not just live through something horrific. They became living proof that conversion therapy fails, that love wins, that being who you are always conquers all, that truth does not disappear just because you lock it in a room and pray over it. And as heavy as all of that is, we're not even done yet, because while some of these stories happened in the shadows, others happened on a global stage, in hospitals, in courtrooms, in countries where being LGBTQ is still seen as a crime or an illness. And that's where we're going to go next. Part 3, let's take it global. It would be easy to sit here and pretend that conversion therapy is some dusty, outdated practice that only happened in the past or only in extreme religious pockets of one country. Something you could neatly box up and label as a very dark chapter we moved on from. But the reality is far more uncomfortable than that. We think this is like some medieval shit. This is modern day, honey. While some countries have started banning it, calling it what it is, and acknowledging the damage, in many parts of the world, it is still happening. It's still legal. It's still normalized. And in some cases, still encouraged by governments, religious leaders, schools, and families. And that right there is the part that should make your stomach twist a little. This is not just a historical issue, this is a now issue. There were survivors who shared their experiences in international human rights reports, people from places where being LGBTQ is not just frowned upon, but criminalized, where families are terrified of social shame, arrest, exile, even death, and they believe sending their child to conversion therapy is actually a form of protection. Think about how deeply tragic that is. Parents thinking they are saving their child from hell or from prison or from violence and instead delivering them straight into psychological and emotional torture. In some countries, conversion therapy isn't even disguised as therapy, it's openly violent. People have been locked in rooms, beaten, deprived of food, subjected to corrective assaults, forced to recite religious texts for hours until their voice breaks, forced to watch heterosexual content and then punished for reacting or not reacting or reacting the wrong way. The goal is not healing, the goal is obedience. And that kind of environment doesn't create change, it creates trauma, fear, and more than nothing, silence. There were accounts of people who had doctors involved, yeah, licensed medical professionals participating in attempts to cure homosexuality through medication or hormone injections or forced institutionalization. People were checked into what they were told were clinics for help and coming out feeling less human than when they arrived. Imagine seeking support and instead being handed shame on a prescription pad. Being told your identity is something that needs to be chemically altered. It's a level of betrayal that cuts so deep it rewires the way you trust the entire world after. In other places, conversion therapy was tied heavily to religion, not just Christianity, but other conservative interpretations too, in cultural contexts where family honor and tradition reign supreme. In other places, conversion therapy was tied heavily to religion, not just Christianity, but to other conservative interpretations too, in cultural contexts where family, honor, and tradition reign supreme. Survivors said they felt like they were carrying the weight of generations on their shoulders, that their identity wasn't just a personal problem, but a dishonor to their entire lineage. That kind of pressure, gosh, that's suffocating. That kind of pressure convinces you that disappearing would be easier than just existing. And some people come dangerously close to believing that permanently. That is one of the most devastating global impacts of conversion practices. It doesn't just try to change who you love, it tries to convince you that your life is not worth living unless you conform and completely change who you are at the core. Some of the stories that surfaced in global news reports are almost impossible to sit with. People being sent away secretly, with relatives told fabricated excuses about where they were. The isolation was often very intentional: no phones, no outside communication, no way to call for help, no way to tell anyone what was happening. And when survivors finally got out, they spoke about how the outside world felt unreal, like they had been away for a lifetime instead of a few weeks or months. That is because trauma stretches time. Trauma rewrites reality, and trauma leaves fingerprints on the mind. Like, it makes me think about Paris Hilton, how Kathy Hilton sent her away because she was misbehaving, was kidnapped in the middle of the night, sent to this camp where they're supposed to just like heal the fact that they're teenagers that are rebelling, and there's no way to contact people. There's a shitload of abuse. The families think they're doing what is right, and it was the only thing they could think of. And it's just, imagine that on a much larger, deeper scale. And of course, my gay ass comes at it with the Paris Paris Hilton comparison. And what's even more horrifying is that in some countries, conversion therapy is paired with legal punishment. Being LGBTQ automatically puts a target on your back, and conversion therapy is positioned as a softer alternative to jail or violence. Imagine being told you can either go to prison for being who you are, or you can go to this program and become normal. That isn't an option. That is emotional extortion. That is state sponsored identity erasure. Human rights organizations have been screaming about this for years, trying to get laws passed, trying to ban the practice, trying to get global leaders to acknowledge the harm. And while some countries have made strong moves, others are still holding onto outdated, fear based beliefs because it gives them control. And control has always been the real issue, not God, not morality, not healing, but control. I also think it's important here to talk about some countries that have nationwide bans on conversion therapy. So, places like Argentina, Belgium, Bolivia, Brazil, Canada, Chile, Cyprus, Ecuador, France, Germany, Greece, Iceland, Malta, Mexico, New Zealand, Norway, Portugal, Spain, Taiwan, Uruguay, and Vietnam are the only countries who have nationwide bans on conversion therapy. Don't see the United States there. And on the flip side of that, these are the countries that frequently are cited in reports by human rights organizations and the UN for having particularly dangerous environments for LGBTQ plus people where extreme forms of conversion practices have been reported. That includes Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Afghanistan, Russia, Uganda, Nigeria. And trigger warning, but in these regions, practices can involve corrective rape, pardon me, electroshock therapy, forced prayer and exorcisms, physical violence, and starvation. The list goes on and on. It's also important to say something else here because, especially for anyone listening who might not be LGBTQ, these survivors are not just tragic stories, they are activists now. By telling the truth, by talking about what they went through, by stepping into visibility, they're dismantling an entire system that was designed to keep them silent. And that is brave as fuck. That bravery it takes to say, this happened to me, when that same truth could have got them rejected, hurt, disowned, or even killed, depending on where they lived, is like beyond comprehension. This is courage on a whole different scale. That is revolution without weapons. That is survival turned into power. Another layer of these global stories is the way culture and colonial history intersect with conversion therapy. In some regions, homophobia was actually intensified by colonization and imported religious ideology, meaning the hatred towards LGBTQ people wasn't even originally part of the culture. It was planted there and weaponized through religion and then reinforced through law. Think about that twisted irony. People being punished today for something that was forced onto their ancestors through colonial rule hundreds of years ago. It's a sick ass domino effect, sick ass in a terrible way, domino effect of control, shame, and oppression that keeps echoing through time. Just like fucking slavery. When people say get over slavery, I don't think so, honey. Just like we're not going to get over conversion therapy and this weird ass shit. And yet, even in the harshest environments, even in the scariest circumstances, LGBTQ people still exist. Hello, we're here. We still find each other, still fall in love, still build underground communities if you need to, still express ourselves in art, in language, in music, in some quiet and not so quiet acts of defiance. That is something no amount of conversion therapy has been able to erase. You cannot erase truth at the molecular level. You can only pretend that it isn't there, because I can guarantee if you could change it, a lot of us would have changed when we were 16 years old to avoid all of this. Like, get that through your thick ass noggins, which is why these global stories are so important to this episode, because they shatter the illusion that this issue is over. They show us that there is still work to be done. There are still laws to change. There are still voices to amplify. There are still people being told today, right now, somewhere in the world, that they are broken because of who they are. And this makes me think about, what's a good example here? Okay, when we were talking about when marriage equality was up for debate, right, a few weeks ago. I've talked about it at length on this podcast. And people were like, well, we're in California. We'll be fine. We don't need to worry about it. But I do have to worry about it. I do care about it because people in other states that are like me, regardless of whether they are in red states or blue states, states that are more religious or not, or right-leaning or left-leaning, whatever, there is still a gay man, just like me, that might live in Texas and want to marry the person that they love, and they will not be able to marry them because we sent that decision back to the States, and obviously Texas would ban same sex marriage. So, thinking about that on a global scale, I might think, well, I'm in California. We're a relatively progressive country. I mean, we're not. But like, why should we care about someone who lives in Iraq? They live there. That's their own issue. That is their own problem. Like, that gay boy who is me, but just happens to live in Iraq, did not choose to live there. They were born there. They were born gay, and they are going to be struggling forever unless they leave that country. We should care about this on a global scale. Just because it doesn't impact you or impact me directly doesn't mean we shouldn't care and that we should completely ignore the issue and be like, oh, well, it's not happening to me. It's not happening here, or think it's not happening at all. I just told you the countries. Like, I'm fighting with you now, listener. Like, I'm imagining people are listening being like, well, why do we care about Iraq or Yemen or this and that? We should care if people are being killed for being gay. Even though it doesn't happen here, it happens elsewhere and it's happening right now. That's my point. And one of the saddest parts of all of this is a lot of the people that experience this believe it, because when everyone around you tells you the same lie, the lie starts to sound like truth. That is why education matters. That's why exposure matters. That's why talking about it. That's why podcasts like this, no matter how sarcastic or passionate or dramatic I actually get, it fucking matters, because information is power, people, and visibility is survivor. And there might be somebody on the other side of the world in a country that bans conversion therapy, in a country that bans being LGBTQ plus and is all for conversion therapy torture. There might be someone experiencing that just happens to stumble across this podcast, if they can even access this podcast, and realize that they are not wrong, they are not alone, that they are who they are, and no amount of conversion therapy is going to change that. So, calming down. Next, we're shifting into a more intimate space, because many survivors didn't just share their stories in articles or interviews. They wrote them. They poured their experiences into entire books, memoirs, long-form confessions, pain turned into pages, and trauma turned into testimony. That is where we are headed next. Part 4, memoirs and long-form literature about forced conversion therapy. Sorry, y'all. I got heated there for a second. I just I just want to reach through the microphone and I hope somebody hears this. Just one person on a global scale, someone somewhere that has been going through this type of conversion therapy or hatred from their family, or being told a lie, that maybe hears my voice and is like, okay, we're going to figure a way out of this. And maybe it just gives them that little boost. I don't know. I just really makes my whole body tingle, full body chills. I just hope out of anything, this podcast helps at least one person somewhere. As I was saying, we're moving on to part 4. There is something uniquely powerful about a memoir. An article can give you the headline, a report can give you the facts, a statistic can give you the scale of the problem, but a memoir, a long-form account of someone's life, does something else entirely. It puts you inside of their mind, inside of their home, their church, their therapy sessions, their prayers, their breakdowns, their breakthroughs. And when it comes to conversion therapy, the memoirs and long-form essays written by survivors are not just stories, they are evidence. They are resistance. They are living proof that the human spirit is far more stubborn than any doctrine that tried to erase it. Survivors who chose to write entire books about their experiences didn't just wake up one day and think, this would make a fun little read. These stories were excavated from the deepest parts of themselves, from parts that are usually completely buried, locked away, avoided at all costs. They went back into memories that hurt. They reopened wounds that barely scarred over time. They revisited the voices that once told them they were evil, broken, sinful, disordered, unworthy, and unlovable. And instead of letting those voices define the ending, they wrote a different one. Many of these memoirs start in the same place: childhood, a religious household, strict expectations, clear definitions of what a man or a woman is supposed to be, something that I believe most of us can relate to. Clear lines drawn between what is normal and what is sin. Authors often describe that first moment of realization, that quiet understanding that they were different, not because they had language for it, not because someone explained it, but because their body and heart just knew. We just know. We don't know what we're knowing, but we know. And that knowledge did not feel wrong at first. It felt natural, curious, tender, confusing, sure, but not shameful. The shame came later, and the shame came from outside voices, not from within. It comes from other people placing that shame on you because they don't understand you. In these memoirs, you see the slow progression of tension building. A sideways glance that lasted too long, a crush on a friend that felt dangerous even in silence, a sermon that suddenly feels personal, a parent's casual homophobic joke that lands like a threat, a lesson at school about traditional family roles. These small, seemingly harmless moments layering on top of each other, building a cage piece by piece around a young person's identity. And all of that experience, conversion therapy aside, is harmful and kind of hard to weed through and unlearn. Then comes the intervention phase of the memoirs, the discovery, the confrontation, the accusation. Sometimes it's a journal being found, a text message discovered, an internet history revealed. We've all had our parents discover our internet searches at some point or another, gay or straight, or all the things in between. Sometimes it's a tearful confession because the guilt just becomes too heavy to hold alone anymore. And in so many of these stories, the response is not love, it's panic. It's rage disguised as concern. It's we're going to fix this. It's just a phase. You've been influenced by the world. And then the introduction of conversion therapy, not presented as something cruel or dangerous, but as a solution, as a gift, or as a second chance. Writers describe the first session in vivid detail: the room, the furniture, the pamphlets on the table, the carefully chosen words of the therapist or religious counselor, the reassurance, the false warmth, the way everything is framed as healing, purification, alignment, restoration. And at first, some of them even felt hope, because when you've been convinced that your existence is the problem, the idea of being fixed almost feels like relief. That's one of the most heartbreaking aspects of these memoirs, the way hope is twisted into self betrayal. And obviously, I'm generalizing all of these memoirs, but they all have patterns and themes, and these are the important parts to touch on. As the pages go on, the emotional and psychological abuse becomes clearer. The repeated questioning, the constant self monitoring, the assignment to avoid certain people, certain thoughts, certain feelings, the instructions to date the opposite sex, to force attraction, to practice straightness like it's a skill that you can master if you try hard enough. Been there, done that, tried, doesn't work. Writers talk about the split that starts to happen inside of them: the public version and the private version, the obedient version and the truthful version, and how exhausting it is to live as two people in one body. You start to lose track of who you really are. You start to distrust your own mind. You start to wonder if the real you is the one you're trying to kill or the one you're trying to become. Some long form accounts go even darker. They talk about fasting, self harm, forced gender conformity, violent prayer rituals, being told to imagine killing their queer self. Think about that. Being instructed to mentally murder a part of your soul in the name of holiness. That is not therapy, that is psychological warfare. And those pages are very hard to read because you can feel the author shrinking, disappearing, dissolving as you go. But you can also feel their consciousness waking up, even if it is very slow, even if it comes in tiny little flashes. And then, in almost every one of these memoirs, there is a moment. Sometimes it's very quiet, sometimes it's dramatic, but there is a moment when something finally breaks through. A conversation with someone who lives openly, a book they were never supposed to read, a song lyric that feels like truth, a panic attack that forces them to confront reality, or maybe a podcast episode that brings them to the light. Not the light of Jesus, the light of realizing that they are who they are and loving themselves, a realization that the therapy is not bringing them peace, it's bringing them closer to death. And that is often the turning point, the moment they start questioning the system instead of themselves. But leaving conversion therapy is rarely simple. These writers describe the process as stepping off a cliff. Family relationships falling apart, communities rejecting them, friendships dissolving, faith structures crumbling. Because when you leave, you're not just leaving a program, you're leaving an entire worldview. that has shaped your identity since birth. And yet, even with all that loss, they describe a strange sense of freedom creeping in. Fearful freedom, unsteady freedom, but freedom nonetheless. And I've said it time and time again, you will find the people that are meant to be there for the authentic version of you. It's, I imagine, terrifying losing your entire family, your circle of friends, everyone you've known since the day you were born. But it is better to be alone and living as your authentic self and learning to love yourself rather than pretending to be somebody else and having all of these people claim to love a version of you that doesn't exist. So then the rest of the memoir often becomes a story of rebuilding, of finding other queer people, of discovering chosen family, of learning how to touch and be touched without guilt, of redefining spirituality on their own terms, or walking away from it completely, finding therapy that actually heals instead of harms, experiencing anger, grief, joy, pride, and finally being able to say out loud, this is who I am, and I am not sorry. What makes these long form stories so impactful is that they don't sugarcoat anything. Healing is not neat, it's not a tidy process in these books. Survivors talk openly about relapse into shame, about struggling with intimacy, about fighting intrusive thoughts, about grieving the version of themselves that never got to exist freely as a teenager. They also write about the beauty of queer love, queer community, queer visibility. The contrast is so stark. The dark makes the light so much lighter. These memoirs are now being used in schools, in training programs, in advocacy work. They are being quoted in courtrooms. They are influencing legislation. They're helping ban conversion therapy in more places around the world because you can't argue with lived experience. You can deny science, you can manipulate theology, but when someone looks you in the eyes and says, "This destroyed me, this almost killed me, and I am still recovering," there's no moral ground left to stand on in favor of it. And the most beautiful, defiant thing about these books, the very act of writing them, is a reclamation of power. People who were silenced now have entire chapters devoted to their truth. People who were told to disappear are now on bookshelves, their faces on the back of those book covers. People who were shamed are now studied, respected, and admired. That is poetic justice on another level. Survivors didn't just get their voice back, they turned it into a legacy. They turned it into education. They turned it into a weapon against the very system that tried to destroy them. And now, after hearing the definition, the history, the testimonies, the global impact, and the literary accounts, there's only one place left to go: the big picture. The damage, the aftermath, the questions nobody wants to answer, the analysis, the rage, the hope, the truth. That is our final stretch on this episode. So, part 5, a little bit of commentary, a little bit of analysis, and a little bit of reflection. We have been through a lot. We've traced conversion therapy from its religious and historical roots, heard the stories of survivors who lived through it, crossed some borders to see how it is happening globally, and dug into a very generalized exploration of the memoirs where people poured decades of trauma onto the page just to survive. And now it's time to talk about the aftermath, the damage, the bigger picture, the long, lingering, often invisible toll that conversion therapy takes on individuals, families, communities, and society at large. Because trauma doesn't just stop at the exit of the therapy office or church or camp. Trauma follows you home. Trauma follows you to your first relationship, your first love, your first heartbreak. Trauma follows you to work, to school, to family or chosen family gatherings, to therapy, to your mirror in your bathroom. And if you've never experienced it, it's almost impossible to describe, but we can try. Let's start with the individual. The psychological damage here for somebody, an individual that has experienced conversion therapy, is staggering. Studies and survivor accounts alike show that those who underwent conversion therapy are more likely to experience depression, anxiety, PTSD, suicidal ideation, and self-harm. It's not just that the therapy doesn't work, it actively hurts them. Every session is designed to reinforce the idea that a person's natural identity is wrong or shameful or dangerous, and that is a form of emotional violence. When someone grows up believing they are fundamentally defective, the effect ripples through their entire sense of self. Confidence, trust, ability to form healthy attachments, all of that can be undermined. Some survivors say it's like being trapped in a house that is on fire and being told that you are the reason for the flames. You panic, you burn, you survive, but those scars remain. And those scars are not always visible. Sometimes they live in your sleep, in your relationships, in your capacity to just believe in your own worth. Then there is the social damage. Families can be fractured, sometimes permanently, when a loved one resists or leaves conversion therapy. Communities that promote these practices are often steeped in fear, secrecy, and control. They teach people to police one another, to shame deviation, to equate acceptance with conditional obedience. When survivors speak up, when they reclaim their identities, they are sometimes shunned. They're disowned or ostracized, and yet, as we said, they persist. They form their chosen families, their queer networks, support systems that are intentionally nurturing in ways the original institutions never were. That's the resilience we want to highlight, but it comes at a cost. It's really work that no one should have had to do in the first place. And then let's talk about the cultural and systemic damage. Conversion therapy is not just a personal tragedy, it's a reflection of societies that prioritize conformity over individuality and control over compassion. It intersects with law and politics and religion and social norms in ways that perpetuate inequality. In countries where LGBTQ identities are criminalized or stigmatized, conversion therapy becomes a tool of enforcement. Parents, educators, medical professionals, even governments can weaponize shame under the guise of help or protection. That perpetuates cycles of abuse, fear, and invisibility. Generations are affected. And because these practices are often hidden or disguised, progress is very slow. Survivors who speak out, they risk not only personal backlash, but also public exposure, legal threats, and sometimes physical danger. Not sometimes, probably quite often, physical danger, depending on where they are. But there's another level and another layer here, a philosophical layer. Conversion therapy does not just attack the LGBTQ plus community. It attacks the very idea of self-determination. It teaches people that the self they are born with is unacceptable, that who they love or how they exist is negotiable, that obedience to outside authority is more important than authenticity. And that undermines trust in institutions, in spirituality, in medicine, in relationships. It tells people that their inner truth is wrong and then blames them for believing in it. That is not okay. That's why, even after survivors leave these programs, they leave therapy or support and they're rebuilding their identity, it's often a decades-long process. It's why memoirs and testimonies are so crucial. They don't just tell the stories, they offer that roadmap for survival, proof that recovery is possible, evidence that you can exist fully, proudly, and unapologetically. It just takes some time. And here's the important truth. While conversion therapy is often framed as a religious rite or therapeutic option, the broader damage makes it clear that it is a human rights issue. The harm is measurable. The consequences ripple across mental health systems, legal frameworks, family structures, and community trust. It is not theoretical. It isn't harmless. It isn't just another way of helping someone discover themselves. It is abuse that is masquerading as guidance. It is harm that is masquerading as healing. It is religion masquerading as love. And we have to call it exactly that if we ever hope to prevent it. Finally, here's a thing that makes me both furious and hopeful at the same time. Despite all the damage, the survivors, the advocates, the global voices that we have discussed are not just casualties. They are leaders, they are activists, they are rewriting the narrative not only for themselves, but for future generations. They are pushing for those bans, for recognition, for awareness. They are speaking in legislatures, in schools, in courtrooms, in media. They are saying, this happened, this was wrong, we are still here, and that's where hope comes in. because change is very slow, but it is happening. Because even in places where the practice is legal or covert, there are people fighting against it. People refusing to let the next generation suffer in silence. People saying loudly, boldly, unapologetically that love is not a disease, identity is not a problem, and human beings cannot and should not force themselves to erase themselves. So when we look at the broader damage, the personal trauma, the fractured families, the societal manipulation, the systemic oppression, it's staggering. It's very, very overwhelming, isn't it? It is horrifying. But when we also look at the courage, the resilience, the activism, the reclamation of voice and identity, it is quite revolutionary. So it's very heavy and dark, but it's also very positive and light at the same time. And that is exactly why I do episodes like this. This is why we listen. This is why we amplify voices. This is why we refuse to let anyone pretend that this is not happening, because the stakes are very, very real and the consequences are lifelong. And the survivors become our teachers, our guides, and proof that truth cannot be erased. So, as we close out this episode, let's take a moment to recognize both the tragedy and the triumph. Recognize the pain that conversion therapy has caused around the world in families and individuals and communities, and recognize the strength, the survival, the reclaiming of self that is occurring every day. And often quietly, we don't hear a lot about the people who escape conversion therapy unless they do write a book or come out in the media. Maybe they wrote a book. Maybe they went on a podcast. Sometimes they're in the court of public opinion. And understand this: nothing about who you are is wrong. No matter what a book, a therapist, a church, or a family tried to convince you of. And that ultimately is the message that survivors are leaving for all of us. The world tried to erase them, and they said, no, here I am, louder, prouder, and unbroken. And that is a wrap on today's dive into conversion therapy. History, survivors, the ongoing fight for awareness and change. I need a nap, and it is only 10 a.m. If this episode spoke to you, please make sure that you subscribe, you like, you rate wherever you are listening, whatever podcast app you are on, and share the episode with your family and friends. It really helps other people find hot air when you share the episode with them, or share the reels or social media posts. This is that broader conversation that I hope reaches far more ears. Like I said, if we can help 1, 2, 3 people in the entire world just from this episode, job well done. And remember to head over to my Instagram on TikTok at _hotairpod to follow, submit your listener stories, topic suggestions, and of course, shop all my fun merch at hotairwithjoshuarobert.com. Thank you again for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember, your voice, your truth, and your story matter. So keep speaking up, keep listening, and I will keep the hot air flowing. So until next time, I'll see you next Tuesday.